this is the Mavic Air 2. What you've just seen is the Mavic Air 2, and I've had this drone for about a year. How I know it's a year? Funny story that. Oh, it's much warmer in here. So how do I know I've had the Air 2 for a year? It's because the Air 2S came out a year ago, and I made a bit of a mistake, a bit of a small boo-boo. Well, you see, a year ago, I was after a drone. At the time, the Air 2 was like the best Mavic, DJI Mavic you could buy, and everyone was raving about it. Everyone said it was really good. So it was coming to the end of the tax year. Obviously, need to get rid of some cash. So I thought, well, I'll just make an expense right now. And in the typical Danny fashion of buying something instantly, I went onto the Jesset's website and bought a Mavic Air 2 Fly More combo, sat and waited for my order to be processed, and it was never processed. It was never dispatched. I never received the drone. I was like, fuck, I need to buy this before the end of the tax year. So I got in touch with Wex Photo and Video and said, have you got a Mavic Air 2 available? And they said, yeah. So I ordered it and it turned up the day after. Unfortunately, when it turned up, it didn't actually come to my house because they couldn't find my house. And I had to drive 30 miles to go and collect it from the depot. As you can probably tell from the story, it seems that I was not actually meant to get the drone. And the reason for that is because the day after, DJI announced the new Mavic Air 2S. So the big question is the DJI Mavic Air 2 worth buying now in 2022? I think the best way to answer this is to head back to the office, and I'll finish off the video right there. Hello, I'm back. So the DJI Mavic Air 2, is it actually that good? And would I recommend that you go out and buy one in 2022? So you use this drone for two things. One being photography, the second one being videography. So when it comes to photography, I think personally that this drone's really good. It has a 12 megapixel sensor, which is the same as a Sony a7S III, so megapixels, it doesn't really concern me. And because I post most of my work over on Instagram, everything I make is pretty much vertical. So when I'm taking a photo with the drone, I take a top shot, middle, and then bottom, and then stack them together, and then you end up with like a 36 megapixel photo, and the detail is pretty damn good for me to be able to post on Instagram. At the end of the day, Instagram just crushes quality, and does anyone actually care about quality? It doesn't take raw photos, but it does take DNG files, which is pretty much the same as a raw file. And with DNG files, you can treat them just like raw files and edit them the exact same as you would do with any kind of digital camera. Annoyingly, I find the camera a little soft around the edges, so you do have to do some extra sharpening in post. But when it comes to photography, I do think it's pretty damn good for most applications. It's a given that the Mavic Air 2S and the Mavic 3 with a larger megapixel sensor will obviously be more detailed than what the Mavic Air 2 is. But if you just want to take some nice photos for yourself and upload them to Instagram or various other social media, it's perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to videography, this drone does fall short when compared to the Mavic Air 2S and the Mavic 3. Firstly, one of the reasons is sensor size. The sensor size of this is really, really small in comparison to the Mavic Air 2S and the Mavic 3. And because of that, the light sensitivity is quite poor, and if you go up to something like 400 ISO or beyond, you do get a lot of noise in your image. The next thing I find frustrating is that it only has 8-bit color. 8-bit color never really used to bother me because you shoot on an A7 III, but ever since having the A7S III, which is like the video king, I guess I've just been spoiled by having that 10-bit color and being able to do anything I want with the image. And obviously in the Mavic Air 2, you're not using log, you're using Cine D-like. So you don't have to pull and stretch the image as much as you would do when you're using log. So you do get to retain a lot of the quality, but if you're shooting the wrong white balance or the wrong exposure, then unfortunately you do lose a lot of the quality of the image when you're trying to correct it in post. Another thing I find really annoying is the dynamic range. Obviously we're only shooting in Cine D-like, we cannot shoot in log on the Mavic Air 2, so the dynamic range is really limited, and unfortunately when when you're shooting any kind of drone footage on a sunny day, your sky is very close to being blown out and your ground is a little underexposed, so you have to kind of bring that back using the highlights and shadows inside Premiere. Obviously, if you're shooting in log, you have a much wider dynamic range, so it makes things easier when it comes around to post. The final thing which really frustrates me is the constant aperture. The aperture of the Mavic Air 2 is f2.8, which isn't a problem when it comes to depth of field because everything will be in focus. But if you're wanting to change the exposure of the shot whilst the drone is in the air, unfortunately you only have the ISO to work with. The reason for that is you don't want to change the shutter speed because you want to obey the 180 rule. And secondly, your aperture is stuck at f2.8. So if you want to decrease the exposure of the shot, you have to use a variable ND filter. So you have to bring the drone down, put a variable ND filter on it, change it and expose the shot on the ground, and then use the ISO to boost the exposure should it be underexposed once it's in the air. And by doing that, you add more noise to your image and it just becomes a bit of a faff. If you could change the aperture, then just stopping down by a couple of stops won't actually change the way the image looks, but it will help with the exposure. That was the problem I had at the beginning of this video, because I took the drone up and the exposure seemed right on the ground, but when I got up there, it was a little underexposed, so I had to boost it up to 400 ISO, and that's why there's some noise in the image. So to answer the question of whether I think the Mavic Air 2 is worth buying in 2022, well, if all that information I've already told you doesn't answer the question, no, I wouldn't get it. Do I regret buying this drone? Well, no, not really, because it's still a very good drone. I do find it really frustrating that I bought it only a couple of days before the Mavic Air 2S came out, and that's the drone I would much prefer over this one. But for the amount of times I actually use a drone, especially when it comes to YouTube, it's good enough for what I do. And when you're viewing it on YouTube with a phone screen, the quality just gets sucked out. So yes, the Mavic Air 2S is a lot better. The Mavic 3 is superior over this drone, but I'm still really happy with it. Now, if you shouldn't buy the Mavic Air 2 in 2022, then should you buy the Mavic 3? Well, I've done a video all about that and you can watch that right here. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then hit the like button as it allows me to show this video to more people out there on the platform. If you want to see more content like this, then hit the subscribe button, and if you do, I will see you right there. Thanks for watching.